The next session is the great debate, the refugee crisis, open borders or closed minds. Please join your hands together as I invite our first guest, Liz Mohn, Vice Chairwoman, Bertelsmann Stiftung, Germany speech. Please also invite Elhadj As Sy, Secretary General, Information Federation of Red Cross, Venu Rajamony, Press Secretary to the President and Additional Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Mr. Riad Abbas, Syria's Ambassador to India,
who heads a 182-year-old company with over 120,000 employees across 70 countries, but most importantly runs a foundation in Germany that helps refugees by the thousands, also helps them integrate at a very young age and also makes them employable. All right, so now on stage we'll have Ms. Mohn.
Lieber Aaron, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich und Ihre Familie. Lieber Herr Sy, Exzellenzen, liebe Freunde, ich begrüße Sie alle ganz herzlich und danke Aaron ganz besonders für diese Einladung.
A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you, Mr. Puri, again for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak on such an important issue before this August gathering. In fact, for the last 20 years, I've regularly been visiting India, and this is something that's already been said today, that India is a wonderful country with a huge potential. The world is changing. 2 weeks ago, I was reading the newspaper, and I read that if you look at India 5 or 10 years further on, I think it is the technology that is going to speed things up, that is going to help us to get to know each other better internationally. It will also enable us to take along the young generation, and that is something that is going to happen in India as well. Just at the outset, I want to tell you a little story from my own life. I was born at 12 o'clock on a Saturday morning. It was the day when war was declared against Russia. My mother and I were alone in the hospital. And so I have actually experienced what it is to have war all around you. Every night I was taken to a bunker at night, and in fact in Germany we had windows that were broken. There was in fact snow coming in through the window onto my bed, and so what I had was a very traumatic childhood in many respects. I recall when I was 12 years old, I stood at the window of my drawing room and I said, I want to do something with my life. And when I was a 6-year-old, I had become a Girl Scout, and when I was 17, I actually started working. Why am I telling you all this? Because I can understand things that happen. We are living in restless times. The world is in a state of flux. And it's something that we haven't experienced since the Second World War. We have a huge number of people who are fleeing today. 65 million people worldwide. They are fleeing military conflicts, they are fleeing persecution, poverty and drought. They are seeking ways to freedom and safety, and that is why they come to Europe. We see this every day on television in Germany. And they come to Europe because they are seeking that safety. This poses a difficult challenge for us in Europe, and particularly for us in Germany. We want to help these millions of people, but we can't help them all. None of us had actually imagined that there would be so many people seeking refuge. I myself have been to these refugee camps, and it's something you can't imagine if you're sitting at your office, at your desk. You have to actually go out, you have to see this, you have to understand the people. There was one refugee camp where I went. There were perhaps 85% of people there, of the men there, who were between 25 and 30 years old. There were very few women with a child. They lived almost as if in a ghetto. They came from a totally different culture. And at the Bertelsmann Stiftung, we immediately took action. We tried to help. We are trying to employ young Syrians. I visit them, they invite me for lunch, they cook themselves. And so when you have experienced all of this, then naturally you're far more ready to help. But of course, this poses a very difficult challenge for us in Europe and, as I said, particularly in Germany. And it's not very simple to overcome this challenge. Perhaps one thing we could try is to, first of all, understand. Because once we understand, perhaps we can try to change things. And according to the latest surveys in Germany, 70% of Germans want to continue helping through donations and through honorary activities. But of course, there are many people in Germany who are afraid of the future, and that too is a big challenge. I have to say that our cities have changed because of this refugee crisis. 10 years ago, the European Union sought to create a ring of friends through its European neighborhood policy. But today, it's actually surrounded by a ring of fire. The conflicts in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, or in Eastern Europe are just a few hours away from Europe in terms of flying time. In fact, it's less than an hour, sometimes it's less than a flight from Delhi to Bombay. We can reach certain areas from Hanover in an hour and 20 minutes. So we are following the developments in Turkey with great concern, as well as the growing populism in France, the United States, and other regions around the world. Syria, for instance, it's a country where peace remains elusive. And we are also concerned about what is happening in Russia. Today, the European Union has 28 member states. And yet, the international community has never been as divided as it is today. And if we're looking at the Balkans, what we are treading on there is very thin ice, and we could break through any time. So if things go on as they are in Europe, and our shared values no longer matter, Europe could disintegrate. That's a huge threat, and I think that's a threat to our democracy and to peace. And that is why we are becoming increasingly worried about the future of Europe. We need to search for solutions together. We must show tolerance towards other cultures. Bertelsmann is active in over 70 countries. We have the biggest publishing house in the world. We understand what it means to give people the space for creativity, for them to have a place where they can work, for them to be able to support themselves, for them to have a roof over their heads, to be able to feed themselves. That is something that I would wish for every single person in the world. So we must search for solutions together. We must show tolerance and understanding towards other cultures, religions, and values. We have to get to know foreign cultures better and not uproot them. And so we must begin very early with this kind of education. We must start in the kindergarten and in schools. That is something what we try to do in our foundation through music, because I think music is a language that every single person understands, and it's something that teaches us tolerance for others. Of course, this is also an enormous financial challenge, and so we must learn from each other, because when we learn from the world, we learn faster. With its diversity, India, like Europe, is constantly undergoing this learning process. And I think this conference is a wonderful opportunity to share these experiences and look for solutions through dialogues, and perhaps find them too. And thereby we could perhaps make a small contribution to peace in the world. We must build bridges of understanding. We can't do that. For instance, we can't just say that we can do it through technology alone, because technology doesn't have such a soft side. But if you look at what a person is doing and trying to understand that person, I think so face-to-face is something that we just cannot replace. We need to build up mutual trust. We need to identify shared values for all people in the world. Mr. C, I'm looking forward to your inputs, and I'm certain that there is much that we can learn from you. We got to know each other at a trialogue in Salzburg, which we organized, where we discuss all the key issues that are occurring around the world. So I'm looking forward to stimulating discussion, inspiring insights, and new experiences that we can take back and employ in our respective fields. For me, it feels like I've read a lot of books all of a sudden. So it's good to be able to learn. In my life, I have experienced this, that the first step is getting to know each other. Then one learns to respect the other. That leads to trust. Trust can lead to friendship, and that can lead to love, and then finally to peace. And that's what I wish for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mohn. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause for Ms. Mohn. Thank you very much for having spoken to us. And yes, it's very important that we actually talk about what was once a massive crisis, but it's tragic that today it's known as a problem. Hundreds and thousands of people fleeing the conflict in their countries are forced to try and find refuge in foreign shores. Often, they are not very welcome in the places that they are fleeing to. So who is responsible for this crisis, and what is the way out? We have a wonderful panel today, but I want to start by drawing your attention to this one image that came to our TV and computer screens in 2015 of a little boy, all of 3 years old, who was drowned while his family was stuffed into a boat meant for only about 6 to 7 people. There were 18 people on that boat. They were trying to flee from Turkey to Greece, and little Ayan Al-Kurdi drowned. He, his mother, and his brother drowned while trying to reach an island in Greece. And it was then that the refugee problem really had this face that simply couldn't be wished away. It couldn't be that easily forgotten. Ayan and his family had earlier fled from Syria, and which is why I want to begin with you, sir, the Syrian ambassador to India. Who is to be blamed, and who is essentially responsible for this massive humanitarian crisis that we have on our hands today?
Thank you for your question, because you asked me about the reason. Nobody likes to leave his country or to leave his home without reason. Terrorism is the reason. Who is behind terrorism? We are facing in Syria cross-border terrorism, funding from Western state and its allies in the region. That is why more than 100,000 mercenaries cross the border into Syria, kill our people, force them to leave Syria. More than 1 million Syrian went to Jordan, and the same number to Lebanon, and more than 2 million went to Turkey, into Europe. Who facilitates them this big movement? Turkish government would like to take Syrian people like a business and to make pressure on European country, because European country doesn't allow Turkey to be a member in European Union. And second reason, because European country doesn't support Mr. Erdogan to make no-fly zone or secure area on his border in our land. That is why, since 40 years ago, we don't heard about any Syrian leave his country and who displays his area. Why it is coming now? Because of cross-border terrorism, this terrorism who hold Wahhabism culture, and it is well known who create Wahhabism.
So, Mr. C, would you agree that countries who are responsible, as the Syrian ambassador says, countries who are responsible for creating the problem should also be held responsible for dealing with the refugees that they basically are responsible for creating? Is it as simple as that?
No, it's not that simple. Let's put things in perspective. This week, 14th of March, was the birthday of Albert Einstein. He was a refugee. Refugees, people on the move, migrants, international migrant workers, they all fall in the categories of person on the move. And today there are 244 million of them. And this we have never seen since the Second World War. Well, we don't have a Second World War, but we are having a situation that is only comparable to the Second World War. What we have to take into consideration is the following. Conflicts are starting and we don't know when they end. People are forced to leave home because home is no longer safe. People have to leave home because they can no longer recover their dignity because they don't have the sources to care for themselves or for their families. And they live first internally, 6.5 million inside Syria first, and then in the region, and then to Europe, and then globally. It is only when it hits, in the borders far away that it becomes a problem. But the so-called problem and the refugee crisis in Europe and in the West represent only 14% of all the refugees. 86% of all the refugees and persons in the move are living in developing countries, in the Bay of Bengal, in Southern Africa, in Eastern Africa, in the Middle East, in Turkey. And I think this is the perspective that we have to take into account. Let's stop the conflicts. Let's stop the wars so that people do not have to leave home because home is no longer safe. Let's protect those that are going to earn their livings abroad by protecting them, because they are not only problems, they are also solutions. They contribute in remittances $436 billion a year. They contribute to global GNP, according to McKinsey, of $6.7 trillion a year. So let them be part of the solution rather than just be seen, as a problem. It is legitimate, and countries sometimes want to protect their borders and then protect their sovereignties. The protection of borders should not be in the detriment of the protection of people. So let's protect humanity, the humanity we share, put people at the center, and then that will be the beginning of finding solution to the problem rather than beginning to blame each other.
You've been 25 years in the area of humanitarian campaigns, whether it be against AIDS or TB. Do you find of late, when it comes to the refugee crisis, developed countries are more hostile, or rather more unwelcoming, more hesitant to accept them as compared to developing countries?
The fact they speak for themselves. I said 14% of the refugees are only in developed countries. 1/4. And that is, it becomes a crisis. And then sometimes we have very short memories. So Ms. Mohn is reminding us what was happening after the Second World War. We then, at the international humanitarian organization in the 60s, we were awarded the Nobel Prize because we were protecting refugees that were running from Hungary because of Soviet invasion to go into Western Europe. In that same place where we were protecting Hungarians, and got a Nobel Prize, I had to go back last year to try to convince the same government, that they need to protect the refugees that are running through the Balkans. I think now is a time for global solidarity. Now it is a time when the world is so global than ever before that building walls, raising barriers will be going counter, the sense, where the world is going into. Tolerance, learning from each other, being more inclusive, be more diverse, and then be protective, and then facilitate the ways of refuge. Then we'll be taking the business out of the way of criminals and traffickers and human smugglers, and then people will be safer, and then we will all be safer.
But Mr. Rajamony, the argument to counter that is that first every country has to protect their own interests. So while Mr. C says there needs to be more solidarity, more inclusiveness, more and more countries like America, like Europe, more and more continents are now saying that we want to look out for our people first. We need to give them first right over our resources. Our resources will get stretched if we accept refugees. And then, of course, there's the other issue which we'll discuss later about how there's the paranoia about refugees being linked to terrorism. Is it fair to judge them in trying to look out for their own interests first, or their own citizens?
Well, as Mr. C just now pointed out, if 86% of the refugees are living in developing countries, these developing countries in which they are living in are actually looking after them to the best of their resources with very limited resources. So the countries which say that we need to look after our people at the cost of refugees who are coming across our borders are not looking at the global picture, where already large number of developing countries are bearing huge, unbearable burden. And if that burden is not alleviated, they could tomorrow turn into another Afghanistan, another Yemen, another Libya, another Syria, another Iraq. So the first and fundamental issue is refugees are a developing country problem primarily, but it is a global problem. And the answer to that problem is not to erect barriers, but to build more bridges. The problem is not insurmountable. It can be handled. It can be managed. But what you need is solidarity. What you need is responsibility sharing. The world has to sit together, talk together, find a solution to the conflicts which lead to refugee flows, end the violence, support countries of first asylum or countries who have large internally displaced before they go across the border, and find long-term solutions of peace building if we have to change what we see in the world today. The picture you showed stirred the conscience of the world, stirred the conscience of Europe in particular, brought the refugee issue to the forefront of the global agenda. But this is not the first refugee flow. And alas, it may not be the last either. Even if we handle this crisis, we must be prepared for the future. And there, once again, the answer is international cooperation, working through the United Nations, global solidarity. If we can just take a word and talk about India. You know, we in India do not see many issues from the frame of refugees. It is not that prominent to us today. But the fact is, India has been one of the countries which has always welcomed refugees, always offered asylum to them. It is believed that the Jews first came to India after being persecuted in 500 BC. And if there is one place in the world where the Jews have never, throughout their stay, faced any persecution, faced any discrimination, it is India. India was born in the midst of a huge refugee crisis. Over 14 million people were displaced due to the partition. 6 to 7 million people came from Pakistan into India. And this entire population was handled by an infant nation struggling to deal with the consequences of partition, struggling to deal with communal riots, struggling to set a national agenda, form a government. And we did it almost entirely on our own with no international help. The recorded largest movement of refugees in modern history is the movement of refugees from Bangladesh to India in 1971. 10 million refugees crossed the Bangladeshi border, came into India within a very short span of about 6 months. India, completely using its own resources with no international help, received these refugees, set up camps for them, provided them food, provided them shelter, medical help. And the Bangladesh crisis is also one of the best examples of what the ambassador of Syria was saying, that nobody wants to leave their home and go to another country. As soon as the crisis in Bangladesh was over 6 to 7 million people immediately went back to Bangladesh, to their homes. So this is also one of the best examples of how a large population of refugees return back to their country of origin as soon as there is safety there.
But since then, has there been a rethink as well? Because yes, like you said, we've had refugees coming in from practically every border that we share. But then there have also been questions raised about whether that led to a strain on our resources in the states that they crossed over into. Well, and there was resistance from the local population.
I think it certainly leads to a strain on any nation's resources. There's no two questions about that. But the question is, what is your view of the world? Do you believe you are part of one humanity? We in India talk about Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. Are we serious about this concept? I believe we are serious, because the common man in India, if at all a picture like this, if a dead body washes ashore of a person from any one of our neighbors, I think it will create as much of a stir within India as it does in Europe.
And you know, we have, unfortunately, we have a huge time constraint, but last minute to you, Mr. Ambassador, you wanted to speak about, you know, what you would like to hear from India in terms of the problem that your country is facing right now.
Please allow me, through you, to express my feeling and my thanks. And we highly appreciate Indian stand about Syrian crisis. If any country do like India, we have no problem in Syria. All our problem came from outside. And if you remember that before, which so-called Arab Spring, our people living in welfare, stability, security, and we receive more than 4 million refugees from outside, living in our home without tents and sharing the bread with them.
Please complete your sentence.
Because of that, after which call Arab Spring, Syria returned the big sources of refugees because of external issue. I am agreed with my friend Rajamony. There is sometimes some internal reason, but in Syria before the crisis, there is no homeless. Everything available for our people, commodities, subsidy commodities, free education, free medication, high security, everything available. But after Arab Spring, we lost everything because of external intervention in Syria. Please allow me to say, Jai India, Jai Syria, Namaskar.
Thank you very much. I think that's the perfect note to end on. Really apologize to all you gentlemen and to also our audience because of the real time constraints that we are working with today. Thank you very much for having joined us.
Thank you so much. It was indeed a very important session on the global refugee crisis and its serious repercussions across the globe. May I please invite Mr. V.K. Sharma, Principal GM, BSNL, to kindly come on stage and give a small token of thanks and appreciation for our guests' time and presence. Thank you. Thank you so much once again. Let's have a huge round of applause once again for our esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, before we head to the next session.